Hello and welcome to this skating lesson. My name is Dave Leese, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Emily and Edward Button to the show to honor their father. Well, welcome to the show.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, I wanted to obviously express the condolences of everyone in the figure skating world. There's been so much going on that, in some ways there were some beautiful tributes to your father, and I think in some ways, somewhat has happened that it hasn't really sunk in for everyone just yet. And I guess, so many of us knew your father is obviously a brilliant broadcaster with, extreme critical eye. But I wanted to ask both of you more what he was like, how you knew him, as a father and, off screen, off TV.
Do you want to take this, Edward?
He was a no, not particularly. He was our father, and it was always very apparent to us that he was a very large character out in the world. And it was just sort of, with both of my parents, with my mother and him, we were skating at 18 months old, and it was just sort of a part of what we did and what our family was like. You know, he was a normal father. I think it took us a long time to realize that a lot of the people we were surrounded with and a lot of, were quite important. He was sort of a normal father that would then, disappear several times a year and pop up on the television set. And we'd all gather around. And I think, at a point we understood that. But first and foremost, he was a father. With his business, he was able to sometimes spend lots of time with us, other times not spend lots of time with us. And so we really got a lot of treasured time there. And it was always, of course, very exciting to go to the events and to, see him doing his thing. Um, he was a really loving father. And, we did, I found once a Super 8 tape, a Super 8 reel in a box of things my father was throwing away. And he had said, go through this reel, right? To go through this stuff. And the tape was labeled Emily Comes Home. And it was Emily, it was my dad shooting and my mom getting out of the car in front of the apartment with Emily in 1975, and her coming into the apartment, and going inside. And it was her coming home from the hospital. So there was lots of just amazing times that were the photographs look just like everyone's photographs of their family and their children, and you being held, and all of the normal things. So there was a lot of normalcy to it, and a lot of, like, just wonderful memories in this time. I think of all these times when, the first day of school pictures and all this sort of stuff. So I think, as a family unit, he was a wonderful father and husband, and we had wonderful times. Not always. He was my father. Like, so, there was always going to be some good times, some not so good times, and but I think it was rather, wonderful upbringing.
He was
Does that
also
answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah, Emily,
he was
you were
also obviously he was very smart. The conversation at the dinner table was always elevated. Elocution was exact. Um, but he was also really fun, and he had a mischief sense to him. Um, and that was just such a great part of our upbringing. He just delighted in things that were a little bit mischievous, practical jokes and different things like that. For example, when we were growing up, he used to take us to Carvel, and there was a large parking lot in front of Carvel. And every time we would go, he would pull into the parking lot, slow down as we're passing it, and say, "Oh, look, it's closed. It's closed." And we'd be in the back going, "No, absolutely not. It's open. I see people." And he'd go, "Okay, we'll go back around." So he would veer around wildly in the parking lot and pass it again. and say, "Oh, it's closed. We can't stop." No! And he would do this several times until finally he would let us into the to go into Carvel. He would park, and
Oh,
except one time he was doing this
no.
with us in the parking lot.
Nobody gets that started.
What?
Nothing, nothing, nothing.
And there was a cop there who pulled him over and was like, "Sir, have you been drinking?" But really, no, he had just been playing a practical joke.
I think you had another good story about an armadillo, when we
Oh,
uh,
yeah. So he, one time, he came home from a trip, and he came home and put in the garage this hard case, carrying case for animals. And there was a huge sticker that said live animal. And there was a little dish attached to the gate that had water and stuff in it. And so, he's like, "I brought you something." And so we all troop out to the garage, and he very solemnly says to us, "Now, what's in here is will stand stock still until it gets scared or startled or what have you. And then it will charge and be fierce." And we were like, "Oh, okay." So we kind of look in the cage and kind of come a little forward and a little more forward. And then the cage would move and we'd go, "Ah!" And we'd run back. So this went on for a little bit until he was like, "Okay, well, I think it's calm enough. We can open the door." And we peer in excitedly and terrified, and it's an armadillo that's stuffed. It's a stuffed armadillo. He had been playing a practical joke the whole time. So,
And I think the context of that story is he had just come back from a trip to North Africa, or had been in Europe and then in North Africa, and had brought it back as a present, and basically, convinced us it was alive, and when it was stuffed the whole time. And I think sometime near after that, the dog tore it apart.
I don't remember that, but
And we must have been 8 years old.
yeah.
well, you mentioned being on skates at 18 months. So how much did you both skate? Did your parents want you to skate? I mean, they're obviously both such luminaries in the sport, but you mentioned education being really important. So I guess what was your relationship to skating like growing up?
We both skated. I loved it. I skated quite a bit. Um, but eventually, my parents felt that they wanted us to get an education and to have a life that they knew the dedication and the sacrifice, and they really didn't want that for us. They felt like they wanted us to have things that they didn't have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it was schooling first, and my father was adamant that, like, I could start training after college. And I think at the time, very much, skaters didn't make tons of money. There wasn't as many places for them to go. So, and I think my mom was like, "Well, I don't know if starting training at 22 is really the best way to go here." And so I ended up, because it was part of school, playing hockey, and I played a year of Division I college hockey, and, like, but I'm 5'8", and I could skate, but I wasn't at the level to play professional hockey. That wasn't in the cards. And so it was sort of one of those things that the dedication to training, it was mutually exclusive to getting a good education at that time. And I think there was, then my parents were divorced. I was approaching high school, and just there wasn't the ability to sort of manage both. And let's say going to school specifically to be able to train wasn't really a thing. At the time, we were both at very sort of high power schools. I went to sort of high power colleges, and the ability to do both wasn't, you sort of had to do one or the other. And that was, I think, what our parents' sort of decision came to about that. And it was their passions. It wasn't necessarily our passions as in the same way. The times were different. It wasn't the 1940s.
Yeah,
It
and
was the 1980s.
I think to add on to that, you know, back when my parents skated, it wasn't really a full year pursuit. They would take the summers off because they were skating outside. And uh, so they had off time. And my dad still went to school. He still skated at Harvard. You know, the training was different. Everything was very different. And my mom actually didn't go to school. She was tutored, and she felt very strongly that we should go to school. She eventually put herself through college, but she felt that that experience was very, very important.
Hmm.
And, you know, as my brother said, education was the most important thing.
Yeah, it was interesting reviewing your father's book from the 50s. He talked about almost like condensed periods of training right before big events. So some of these, you know, technical feats, that things that he was doing, he mentioned getting the double axel and his, you know, his triple loop like right before the Olympics and like putting it in the big moment. But he had only really been landing it in the practices probably a week or two before the event and went and did it, which is, you know, really incredible, but such a different time, obviously.
It's a very different time. They
Yeah.
used to go to Europe, oh gosh, 6 weeks before an event and, you know, go by boat and acclimate, train there, you know, wherever the competitions were.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned about, you know, the monetary, you know, opportunities in skating, and obviously your father created many of them. So I guess I was wondering if you had ever, you know, spoken to him about, you know, what happened after he won, because there weren't those, you know, opportunities besides just being in an ice show, you know, what he was going to do after he had, you know, accomplished, you know, 2 Olympic gold medals, uh, all of his world championship titles, you know, national titles and things like that.
Well, and that's what, you know, I think his fear of allowing us to put off things like college to train was that then what, you know, would we go? Would we get an education? Um, and so he was very nervous about that. And so that was where sort of early on, um, they decided against it because there wasn't, even though he had created in the 70s and into the 80s, had created was creating all of the, you know, ability for there to be a professional career in skating. That was not, I don't think it was in his mind that that was like, you know, you could train, then you could go to the Olympics, then you could be professional, then you could pursue an education. Or, you know, I think later it became less mutually exclusive. You know, there was financial resource, the war. So it was at a time when the world of that world was in flux. So, you know, then that's what he, you know, he said it. That's where his idea to create some of these things was from the fact that there had been nowhere for him to skate. He also, you know, came along, you know, there's a saying, would you rather be lucky or would you rather be good? And my father was both. Like he nailed it. He got both because he was good. He, you know, won everything. He was maybe perhaps the best that ever lived. Then television was coming along, and television, it really, you know, television was really started by sports and news. Those are the two things that you needed live for. Like, why did something need to be live? Like, that's what built the networks at the time, was television and news. And so he had the opportunity, you know, they needed programming. The television was only on 6, 8 hours a day or less. And so there was a need for programming. So his opportunity and timing met what he knew and was excellent at. And that, I mean, that's just a brilliant combination. And he had the energy and focus and put in the hard work to bring them both together, and was able to sell these programs to television, which made them possible to make money, or for to have prize purses, and for people to make a living doing this outside of, let's say, the touring shows. You know, they could continue to figure skate and have a professional career. So that combo of events, and then my father was able to see that and do that, was just fantastic. I mean, unbelievable. He says one of his first shows, and I don't know the total facts on it, but he sold, I think, one of the first televised recordings of I think it was the World Championships, and I'm not sure what year it was. It must have been the early 60s, where he was at the World Championships and he went and went into the crowd, and everyone was filming with Bolexes, like home video style, but film. And he went and he bought everyone's videos from everyone's films from them, and then cut it all together and use that to sell to sell the idea that we can televise this, and we can do that. I think he might have even sold it as a broadcast. I mean, it's very early, like in the first couple years of television. Um, so uh, he had real foresight into that, and was really revolutionary in bringing sports to television that wasn't baseball and football, basically. To bring these individualized sports. It is sort of the origins of professional sports, that was in terms of it being a pursuit you could make a living at. Like even at the time, football players had other jobs, and maybe there's tennis, but a lot of those followed in suit from this.
How did he learn production? TV production. Obviously, he was involved in Wide World of Sports, and on the ascent with that as that was growing. But how did he learn, the art of producing? Was he already doing that before he started TV, or did that come after?
Well, he was, and I'm, my father lived such a varied life. There's a million stories of all of this from so many people. He was talent. He was one of the early broadcasters. He had acted in revivals he was in South Pacific. He was in a bunch of television shows as talent. And he had, I think, one of his early productions was Dick Button's Ice Extravaganza at I believe it was the 1966 World's Fair. Was one of his first, like, productions, and he had been dabbling in production. He had a business partner in Candid Productions called Paul Feige. Paul Feige was a very successful and well-known producer. He produced Omnibus with Alistair Cook. He was responsible for bringing the Thai dancers to America to perform on that show, bringing sort of Thai culture to America. So he was sort of the artistic side. And figure skating, as you know, is sort of athletic sport meets artistry, especially at that time. And so Paul and him, and I'm not sure all of the origins, but they had a production company together. And Paul was already a producer, and they, through that production company, created World Professional Figure Skating Championships, the Superstars, which then spawned Battle of the Network Stars. And then they, along with other smaller productions and eventually some Broadway, they optioned certain books for screenplays, and had a varied production company. But Paul, it's my understanding, Paul sort of taught him the ropes of how producing entertainment worked. Not necessarily, they produced live events, but everything was for television. So how the television industry worked from a more of a behind the scenes perspective.
You actually worked at Candid Productions, so I was wondering if you could just talk about some of the things that you worked on, and kind of the breadth. I think so many people who watch this grew up in the 90s, and they remember the US Pro and the World Pro and everything, and sometimes they'd be on different networks. And I think not everyone realized that your dad produced them, was responsible for all of them, the reason, why they existed in that way.
Yeah, I mean, we were, I've unearthed pictures of us at like 4 or 5 years old at the Superstars with our, ID lanyards and badges with our names on it, being from the production company. I mean, earlier than that, probably, yeah, 4 years old, 3, 4 years old. I believe he started the Superstars the year I was born, which would have been 1973. The So yeah, I always wanted to work for my father. I thought what my father did was I loved the show. I mean, I can remember standing in Landover at the World Professional Championships and the crowd, and I just loved that the show of it, as well as figure skating. But for me, it was always the show, and it was the excitement of the crowds. And so what we essentially did was we produced, ran the event. Um, and so like at Landover, there's the World Professional Figure Skating Championships at I guess it's now the CAP Center. And we would put on that event. So we would go, we'd work all year. We had maybe five events. Uh, because at that point, by the time I came to work for him, they were still doing a few small things, but the Candid was really just doing the figure skating events. There was World Pro, I believe Can Pro, Euro Pro, uh, the America,
US.
the US Pro. I think it was four or five. So I had always wanted to work for him. So I guess when I was perhaps 17, I went to a college that was on the trimester system. So they ran three of those events right in December, right in the first part of December were the three of the events: the Euro Pro, the World Pro, and the US Pro. And I believe the Canadian Pro was in January when I was back in college. So when I was in college, I started working on the shows. I went to, um, hang on a sec. I'm sorry. I'm only seeing my sister, and it's a
Oh,
little hard to talk to her.
Sorry.
it's okay.
I don't know why this is. Let me. Sorry. I hope you will be editing some of this.
Okay.
There we go. That's much easier. Sorry, I'm like talking to my sister.
Okay.
Um, uh,
Gee, is that a side insult,
well,
Edward?
it's hard to answer a question to somebody else.
It's okay.
Uh, so I would work for him. I said, I want a job, and I was in college, and of course, my father was rather not cheap, but he was frugal when it came to paying for things. And so I was in college. I had no money, so I was like, "Hey, listen, I'm off of school from Thanksgiving till January. Can I work on the shows? Like, is there something I can do?" So I would go on the road trips. I did it probably 3 years of college. We'd have a road trip where we'd go to, uh, let's say, Sacramento to do the US Pro, and we'd go to Landover to do the World Pro, and we'd go to then, 1 year we were in Innsbruck doing the European Pro. And so I would work for those 3 or 4 weeks for him, and it was awesome. Like I would go, here I am 17, maybe 19 years old, 20 years old, 21 years old, and I'm getting to go to Europe. I went to Japan for for I think Challenge of Champions was in Japan. I did a show in Tokyo, the Yoyogi Arena. So I got to see the world with them and flying around the world with my dad and, being behind the scenes. Eventually, when I graduated college, I worked, running the sets. I would manage the sets being put up and stuff when I was 22. But I'd say before I was 23, I had worked on about 12 or 15 of the shows. Um, and it was just a wonderful experience. They were fun. My dad was the boss, and it was super fun. It was listen, I've got to change this to see all three of you because I this is very hard to talk staring at.
While he's doing that, that is like one of the things about my dad is he was fun and he was very charismatic and funny, and he has this on-screen persona which is very much him as well, but
There
he
we go.
never showed as much of that humor. Like one of the most delighting things is to make my dad laugh and hear him, because it just was so joyous, and he loved that. He was, always looking for some humor or a fun story or something.
How much was your mom involved in all of this, growing up, in some of his, business things as well as, all of his skating activities? Obviously, she had been, the coach of Janet Lynn and Jordy McKellen, but, how much of an insight did she have into all of, his career?
Just wanted to finish one or two things about the going on the shows. He ran this company with a very small office, and everyone knew each other very well. And so it was like an extended family. There was only like 4 or 5 people working in the office. It was an extended family, and we go together. There was always to make sure there was time to have dinner together. There was so it was a lot like a family business is what it felt like. And getting to go around the world and to learn all these insights, there was always be an educational aspect, learning about this, look at this happening, look at that happening. Um, it to the point where I felt a part of that family. And so I think it was a really wonderful business that he ran. And it really was, it was a height. It was a height of the popularity of skating. I mean, you can really track, you can make a case for the popular in America, at least. The commercial popularity of skating, the rise and fall starts and ends with his involvement with Candid Productions. And as the professional world was taken away, the the popularity, at least in the United States, started to wane. His shows were doing like we're beating Seinfeld ratings back to back on a Saturday night. The only larger uh, one-time sporting event that garnered more views in the world was the Super Bowl. And so, it just, as he always put it, uh, the mothers out there love us, the fathers don't mind watching it, and we'll switch over from the football game, and we'll switch over from that thing. So it was a really special and magical time, both in the world and in my life. Um, I mean, I just loved it.
Well, Emily, I wanted to ask about your mom. You had, were telling me about phone conversations between your parents, and I was wondering if you could talk, about, the dynamic that they had.
Yeah, one of the things that they remained great friends uh, till the end of their lives, and used to, when we would have family things, the two of them would sit at the end of the table, talking about skating, and uh, really, it was so fun and interesting to listen to and watch because it's possibly the two most knowledgeable people about the sport, talking about different things. But he used to, before an event, talk to my mom and say, well, what do you think about this skater or that skater or this rule or that? And so they would talk about those things. And then she would watch the broadcast a week or so later. And she would be like, darn it, I said that. I said that. So we used to get some notes from her.
And intellectually, she was no slouch either. So that's a really interesting, kind of rapport between the two of them.
Well, I think what an important thing there was that, she was really was a iconic uh, expert, and created, there was no skater different after Janet, and all skaters were different after her. And my mom, you know the we were all told, she was told years later that the Russians would send people to the rink to sort of spy on her, to see what she was doing and how she was getting it to happen. And so that so he really respected her opinion and relied on it. My father was a gatherer of information, and he would ask her all the time about what all the time he would rely on her opinion on skaters.
Yeah, and she had a little bit of a different experience than my dad. with respect to teaching, but also anatomy. She was a biology major in college, and then she studied anatomy, like a lot of the books or anatomy books that she had, so that she was really learned on a very deep level about that. Um, but both of them were very smart and knew a lot about a lot of different things. And so the conversation between them was always top notch. Interesting ideas, furniture, places they'd been or seen, world events, all sorts of topics.
Yeah, when I met your mom at the World Championships in 2016, and she was talking about how the physicality of skaters was different from not training the figures, and how it related to the nervous system, and then how it related to injuries and what they were doing. It was fascinating, but it was way over my head. But yes.
I can kind of give it to you a little bit from another perspective. She always said you want to get on the ice as soon as possible when you're young, because there are neurons in the bottoms of your feet that develop differently if they develop when you're young. And so it's like training the feet and the mind and the brain all together, right? Um, yeah, the abolition of figures was very difficult on the how you train skaters.
Yeah, I think you can see it in the product of skating today. Well, you're an actress, and I wanted to ask you about, the influence of your father in that, because obviously he had such a love of theater. If you ever listen to him speak about anything, and I was, curious about his involvement in theater and, what that relationship and influence was like on you.
One of the favorite things I did with him was to go to the theater. That was always our thing. And we would go all the time. And so that was very influential. And then we would talk about it after. We'd go have dinner and then we'd talk about it. So that was really the beginning of my understanding of theater. I will say, I did a show once and my father sat next to the LA Times in the audience. And I will tell you, I was not afraid of the LA Times, but I was a little afraid of what my dad would think. Like I wanted to impress him, you know? So he made the LA Times look small. um, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I do know that he was, a theater producer, obviously. So I was curious how extensive that was, or if you had any knowledge of that. Yeah.
It was fairly extensive at a certain point, and he was more or less involved. It was either more on the money side, or he wasn't as involved in the production aspect at certain points. So yeah.
Now, you're both creatives, and you mentioned your father being critical of your work. So I think, skaters will refer to what it was like to be criticized by him. So I guess, what was that like for both of you? Because you both have very interesting careers.
Uh, well, when we spoke before, we had mentioned, he only criticized people that he either liked or that he felt had room for improvement, like they were already good enough that they could improve from what he had to say. So, in a lot of ways, it was always framed as a compliment if he engaged with you around your work. Um, so that was, that was. I'm not very well spoken tonight.
Did you believe that though? Did you understand that as a kid, that he's criticizing because he thinks there's ability there, or did you?
Yes. Oh no, he mentioned that all the time, and he mentioned that about skaters specifically, and also us. Like if it wasn't of a certain caliber, or you weren't interesting as a skater or interesting as a performer or an artist or what have you, there was no reason for him to comment or criticize. Criticism was a form of him wanting to make you better, but wanting to make you better because he already thought you were capable and good. Does that make sense? Edward,
Yeah.
maybe I think you maybe said it better than I did.
I think fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, mothers and sons, all have different relationships. Um, my father didn't understand what I did for the majority of my career. Remember at one point, I think he finally understood what I actually did, not just what the title was or what, but what do you actually do? He never really understood what actually I did. I remember once I took him to, this is probably 12 years ago, 15 years ago. I had shot uh, part of a movie that was playing at the AMC theaters, right? It was a national release. It was a David Duchovny, Hope Davis movie. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to take my dad to like a normal theater. Like we're going to buy popcorn. It's not a premiere. It's not any of this stuff. We're just going to go to the theater. And I wanted to see what my work on the screen. And we watched the movie. And as we left, he goes, okay. Because I had only shot about a third of this movie. I was shooting a very specific unit on this movie, doing a very specific type of very creative work. And when we left the theater, he goes, well, I could tell what you did versus what the other guy did in a complimentary fashion, and saying, well, it was very obvious what you did because I could see your eye, I could see your creativity in that, and then I could understand. And I think that was the first time he actually understood what I did. I just don't, I do sort of very complex things that I would try to explain to him, well, I take this, I have a crew and we do the lighting and we do this and I'm responsible for the image and blah, blah. And I just don't think he quite understood it because he didn't per se understand how movies are made or immersive entertainment is made or virtual. And later when I started doing a lot of virtual reality and augmented reality and stuff, I mean, he was 85 plus at that point. It was difficult enough to get him to use his computer correctly. I mean, that's a little bit of an over average statement, but my father had us a little later. He was born in 1929. So, but I do distinctly remember, I think that moment when he kind of like, oh, I see what you do. I can now see it for myself. Cause I think my father, you could tell him things and he could understand them, but but he really required him to see it himself. Like he really had to see skaters skate themselves to really understand. There was never a practice before an event that he missed. There was never. I mean, he was the diligence of his notes, the thickness of his notebooks on things was so great because he really had to take and like so any comment he made was coming from actually seeing something and then digesting it, then figuring out what he thought of it, and then telling, and then not necessarily commenting, but narrating the experience of what's happening. He had said, I don't commentate, I narrate. And I think that's very insightful.
Well, I think it's interesting too. Even if it's a skater, he didn't particularly like their style. He really understood who the important personalities were and why, and could identify that for the viewer and how important that was. I mean, he writes about Irina Slutskaya extensively, like over his book. And in one hand, maybe he didn't like her style, but he loved her character and different things about her. And he did kind of create reality TV competition. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Superstars, Battle of the Network Stars, so people who weren't around during that time, but that was really part of the big careers of, Bruce Jenner, OJ Simpson, and kind of how they
Well, that ties into what you just said because I think he took the whole skater or the whole person and understood inherently how the personality and the character was extremely important in the entire picture. He could see the entire picture. He had told me that his idea for the Superstars was you've got all the top athletes are incredible personalities. And most of them are incredible personalities, and they're all professional at one aspect that they're the best in the world at. So what if we wanted to see who, if you notice, it's called the superstars, not the super athlete. And so who is the biggest athletic star? And you could do that by having them compete in sports that none of them were professional at. So you've got a football player, you've got a football player, a baseball player, a hockey player. You have a track and field guy, Bruce Jenner. So you have Bruce Jenner, Mike Gastineau, like all these great athletes, but then you have them race bicycles against each other. You have them swim against each other. You have them do an obstacle course against each other. And through that, those shows weren't just popular in my mind for the aspect of them that was the athletic competition. It was also that the personalities came out, and that the personalities, and how they negotiated things and how they competed against each other, not being regular competitors. Now you can view, so in that aspect, you can view some of it as a reality competition. Today we have Mr. Beast, right, with these just enormous numbers he puts up, but what he's really doing is competitions, and competitions amongst people that aren't experts at that thing. To extend it, there was a natural extension to go to the Battle of the Network Stars. So now you have movie stars and TV stars, mostly TV stars, competing against each other. And that's even more about personality and about this. So that entire picture. And so you can view some of that as some of one aspect of the origins of one aspect of reality television. There's actual, several shows that were just a normal family living their daily life in California that's well documented. But in terms of a competition reality shows, it's sort of some of the early aspects of that.
Also, it was born out of my father's fascination on athleticism and what made a good athlete, and how some athletes could be very good at one thing. Did that make them an excellent athlete across all genres, right?
Mhm. Yeah. I was curious, like someone like Tanya Harding, had she not been involved in the Nancy Kerrigan scandal, do you think that's some like a personality that he would have then promoted later on? Like someone with that kind of a unique persona?
I don't know. That's a good question. Um,
That's a complex thing, because clearly many believe that sensationalism isn't the attraction of the sport,
Mhm.
and that they shouldn't be confused. But at the same time, that event garnered so much worldwide attention and made it, for a percentage of the population, it drew them into what this was. And figure skating is one of those things that, for I think a lot of people over a lot of time, don't necessarily, it's like going to the ballet, right? It's something like certain section of the population would be like, that's not something I'm interested in. And then on a trip to New York, they end up at the ballet, and the one or two people in the group that would have ever been interested in it are suddenly crying, and they're like, oh my God, this is incredible. And so that sort of sensational drama drew a lot of people in, and boosted the viewership, and built a lot of fans for figure skating, because then through that, they tuned in to see the great competition, and then the drama, and then came away loving the sport.
Mhm.
And so I think there was a conflict of, the businessman in my father and the promoter. My father, when I was working for him, I can remember a guy on the crew being like, your dad's incredible. I mean, just being around him, I feel like, he's the Don King of figure skating. He's a huge personality. And so I think that businessman and the promoter in him certainly did not mind that. I think the side of him, a side of him also was somewhat dismayed, is that that's what ultimately increased the popularity of the sport, like as it did, right? So that was sort of dismaying, but also, hey, we've got, another million viewers during this time, and they can all get to see figure skating, and isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. I think what I was asking is, I think the narrative has always been that, that event happened because, Tanya wanted money from, figure skating, or the people around her did. And I wonder, she had that kind of unique personality like we were talking about, that he could have seen, had that event not happened, that's kind of thing he might have seen value in. So,
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly. I can speculate, but I can say at that time period, and I think a lot of people would agree with me. And I'm not an expert; I'm just conjecturing. But that, since the rules, so because you had two scores, you had one for artistic merit, or there was the artistic score and the technical scores. Uh, the people with flair and personality were were rewarded for that. So you got, look at the cast of characters in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Peggy Fleming, Dorothy Hamill, Christopher Bowman, the Protopopovs, uh, Brian Boitano, Nancy Kerrigan, all Tanya Harding. These are big personalities. It was entertaining in a certain way, and as you start to take away the rewarding of the artistic aspect, you get a much more technical type of skater, and that probably affects some of the personalities in a way that is maybe less universally entertaining. Does that get close to answering what?
and I think you could draw, a direct correlation in terms of viewership and the actual product on the ice. It's something that your father saw the full picture in, as you were talking about why, why the technical driven sport is not as, you know, entertaining or as popular as it was before.
Well,
Well, it is popular here. I approached so I've had some deep conversations with people over the last 5, 6 years about that. Here, if you look, it's actually gained popularity in China. And
Yes.
some of that is that there's a deeper understanding of that aspect. That's more universal for them. So it's shifted the popularity, perhaps away from the United States and perhaps less or so in Europe, but it's gained popularity in different areas that maybe didn't have as much a history of it.
Emily, you were about to say something as well? Yeah.
oh, I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to say more technical, because when you got rid of figures, the technique was no longer as sound.
Hmm.
It kept people from being injured, and taught them how to use all of their leg muscles and different things, and it developed those muscles in a way that the free skating never does.
Mhm.
So I actually think skating before was more artistic. I mean, not artistic, more technical, because the technique was very solid from the figures. I think it's more an emphasis now on jumping and hitting all of the requirements within the program. And you have to place a jump in a certain spot because of the scoring and all of that, which both my parents disliked greatly. But for my mom, it was very interesting because she was such a brilliant choreographer. She understood music in a way that was completely innovative. And her choreography was so good. Um, and so that was very hard for her to see how, like, programs then got broken up according to elements and had to be in this way and that way. And she didn't like that at all.
She was not thrilled with the skating when I talked to her that night. I remember at the World Championship, she was not thrilled with the product. One thing,
And neither was my dad.
yeah,
Both of them talked about this quite a bit with the rule changes and the figures. It was, and they both worked with the World Pro figure. Uh,
Karen Cortland,
yes,
yeah.
Courtney Kelly. Both of them really, really were invested in that and felt that it was very important.
World Figure Sport. Yes. Yes. I wanted to ask a little bit about, you mentioned when we had talked, it was kind of a funny story that, ABC lost the rights to figure skating after 2008. And you mentioned that your father's contract was up for renewal around that time and that he was actually furious about the whole thing. And I think that that was something that people didn't understand, his passion at 80 years old to keep going. And I think, Edward, you said it was about a 5-year extension instead of a 10, and that.
I'm not sure when that was, but at some point he, in his final contract was a little bit shorter, and he got very upset that he had gotten a shorter contract, like that maybe, and I remember being like, Pop, you're an octogenarian, you know, like I think he just got very upset that, he had been such a mainstay. But it was charming.
I will also add, he did the show Push Dick's Button. And I remember talking to him in the middle of all of that. And he kept saying, "Ugh, they have me up in this area, not in the rink. I can't be in the rink watching the skaters." And he just wanted to be in the room to feel the electricity, to hear the blades, to smell the ice, to be live with it. And in the way that Edward said, he really liked to have that experience. And he loved skating so much that he wanted to be there with that.
And would he keep watching it until, kind of his last days, still stay current with everything that was going on?
I'm not really sure. He did somewhat. I mean, I know when he was tweeting, we used to watch quite a bit. But I think at a certain point, I'm not really sure. Do you
I
want?
mean, I went to see him in the last few weeks, and there was skating on the television.
Oh yeah.
I don't think in the last couple of years he followed it as in depthly as he had. But if skating was on, both my parents were watching it. I think there the changes in the sport, a combination of being in your mid 90s and the changes in the sport, I think made him, both my parents, they still watched it and they still were very, thought a lot about it, but it became less of a dinner table conversation. And they were both in their 90s, and so they were more interested in what we were doing, more interested in this, and they, but when we were younger, we'd have a holiday dinner. When we were teenagers, it'd be a holiday dinner, and the whole family'd be there, and inevitably there'd be, so Slavka, tell me what you think of so and so, and it would become the table conversation. And I think so. Just in the last couple of years, I mean, they definitely both still watched, and they definitely both still had opinions. It just wasn't as dominant of a conversation as it had been for the 40 some odd years prior to that, of my experience with
Yeah.
them.
My mom definitely in the last year of her life was watching, she always watched skating. Always, always, always. And I had a friend over and we were all watching it and she was critiquing it. And, this is the last year of her life. She's critiquing and, mentioning this is this and this is that and this is why this worked, this is why this didn't. So, yeah, she was very still involved with it in that regard. Both my parents loved skating so much that they collected things with skaters on it, that they, spoke about skating, they read about skating. It was in their souls.
I mean, the poster sitting behind you, is one of hundreds that adorned both my parents' homes.
Okay. Yeah.
We have that poster for sure.
Okay. Yeah. Well, most people actually get it wrong about who is on the poster, including Dorothy Hamill, whose name is on there we said, is that taller? But it's the angle of it. It's John Curry. But
Yeah.
I was gonna say it's John Curry. Yeah.
Of
yeah,
course, it's John Curry, and John Curry. John Curry. When after my mother had us, John Curry wanted my mother to start to do his skate company with, and she actually turned him down because she didn't feel she could commit the time to both. Um, but yeah, no, definitely John Curry.
there was a funny, I was talking and I've been preparing a piece on your father and just talking to Dorothy Hamill that she was telling me that in the early days of the World Pro that, the skaters hadn't bought into risking their titles against each other. So there was a group competition aspect. And to try to get John Curry to wear some poofy shirt that everybody else was wearing was, it involved your father doing quite the negotiation and discussions at the event because John Curry was not bought into skating in a group to whatever, they wanted. But, the revolutionary to get everybody to compete and risk their titles, which was kind of, unthinkable at that time in skating.
He always was putting together interesting things.
Mhm.
He I don't know if people know he went to law school and was a lawyer, which definitely informed his production work and his understanding of contracts and the way that he saw the world. He always said that it was such a great education, but he never wanted to practice law. He was a collector of antiques and art, and he would go and he would develop relationships with artists. He collected early American furniture and Hudson River Valley paintings and things like that. And he became really well versed in all of that. He was always learning something, and he was always reading a book or a newspaper or educating himself on his varied interests. And he loved combining them. He loved all of his art about skating or of skating, and he loved always knowing the artists and how they were related to skating and all of that. And he also brought it into his garden. So he was a very accomplished gardener, and he, in different sections, had odes to different skaters. In one section, he had or has a a figure, the first figure that he ever did, made out of boxwoods. So it's got the little loops and all of that. It's really quite stunning. And so, he would nickname different flowers after different skaters and things like that. So he really loved bringing that all together. And I'm not quite sure that people really knew what a Renaissance man he was because he was so proficient in skating, but he became very, very proficient in all these other areas. I remember my mom saying one time that they had been to Studio 54, and she said it was such an interesting evening because they had sat with Arnold Schwarzenegger and discussed Tiffany lamps the whole night. I mean, it's that type of thing, bringing in other things other than skating into your experience.
And he brought all of those elements into skating
Yes.
and skating into the other elements of life. That was one of the magical things about both of my parents is that they could see within. My father was a big fan of pier tables, and he would look at a Duncan Fife corner and element that moved within that had an angle to it and a line to it, and he would relate that to skating or skating to that. And that was one of the most magical things is to how to see a arc of a line in the ice out in the rest of the world, and how to see the rest of the world in the arc of the line on the ice.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask you about is I was, researching your father and quotes about his brother came up. Was his brother actually involved in getting the Olympics to Lake Placid? You talked about your families going to Lake Placid for 5 generations. They had quotes about your Uncle Jack before the Olympics were in Lake Placid about how it was going with tourism and things like that. So how important, were they into that city, which is such a part of skating and Olympic history?
I'm not sure how involved he was on getting the Olympics to Lake Placid. Do you know, Edward?
No, but between Gus Lucy's children who own hotels there, and my Uncle Jack, who was there, they, I could conjecture to say that they promoted the development that the city would need to get the Olympics. You know, in the competition to get the Olympics, and in the drawing for that, that they were instrumental in providing some of that infrastructure. And you know, the town had to, a small town, it's not like Paris. And so that town needed to say, okay, this is how we can do this. This is how we can bring this. We need to build this. We need to create this and that. We need to, you know, we need to refurbish this, you know, and how do we do that? So I can say that they probably were involved, but I can't comment as how much they did that. I would say Sergei Lucy and Caroline, you know, were for certain involved with that aspect, but you know, would be more involved with that aspect. I just don't know you know, to what extent. I was only 7 years old when the Olympics were there, so I would have been 5 years old when they were in that process, or 4 years old. So
You almost had a big TV moment at the Olympics where they were going to show you both on TV, and your dad put a stop to it. But there is a clip of it. I can't find it. Um,
he got it off the air before they put the name underneath.
yeah.
He didn't want anyone to know. Yeah, he was always very afraid. He didn't want anyone to know about us on a certain level. He was always afraid that, you know, he'd have a Lindbergh baby.
Well, I guess if we wrap this up, you know, what would you like, you know, everyone to really know about your dad, or remember him by?
That's a hard question because he had so many different sides to him.
Mhm.
And it's hard to pick one thing that he should be remembered by.
Mhm.
I think for people out in the world who didn't know him personally, I'd love for them to know how intelligent, fiercely intelligent, and well educated he was through his whole life. He was always learning, always up until the end, involved in thinking and working things out and learning new things, and that he was fun and charismatic, and he brought people together. He was very good at having interesting dinner parties and different, you know, people always wanted to be around him. And so I'd love for them to remember that, as well as his commentary, which was insightful and intelligent, and, you know, had a little bit of sass to it.
And how about you, Edward?
You know, my dad had a huge heart.
That too.
He had a gigantic heart. And as his son, you know, I can say everything he did, he led from the heart. And he just wanted to do the best he could with everything. And everyone, you know, we've all make mistakes. He would continually comment on what he felt were his own mistakes. And you know, he wasn't afraid to admit a mistake. And but he always led with his heart. He had a huge heart. Um, and he could be fierce. He was, and anybody that did business with him knew that. You know, he could be fierce, but he always led with his heart, a gigantic heart. And really, you know, if my mother was my best friend, you know, my father was my idol. And he you know, to do right by him was a big deal. Because and because he had such a big heart, he loved very strongly and very hard. And you know, once he loved somebody, it really was pretty hard for him to stop. You know, I can remember at one point, just 10 years ago, I said, you know, one day I was sitting with him, and I was like, gosh, you know, lately kind of miss Uncle Paul. That was Paul Feige. It was our Uncle Paul. And he goes, gosh, so do I every day. And he died 42 years ago. And this is still on his mind. The 61 plane crash was still on his mind. And that's because those were all little heartbreak moments, because he had such a big heart. When you have such a big heart, you know, it sticks with you when it gets broken. So, you know, my dad he was a wonderful, sweet man who was also a towering character and fierce. And, you know, he's just, you know, he was my dad. So also I have an absolutely different perspective as anyone else, you know. Um, but yeah, he was my dad and he had a huge heart.
Very well said, Edward. I second that. Extraordinarily generous.
Well, thank you both so much and for being so generous with your time and sharing so much with us. So thank you both so much for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure.